Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I consider it a great privilege to be given this opportunity of sharing with you some thoughts and perspectives about the contemporary Sri Lankan experience. You're aware that my country is emerging from the shadow of a very long conflict, which is happily behind us. And we are now in a position to set our country back on the course of accelerated economic and social development. The indicators in every sphere are uniformly encouraging. The growth of the economy, per capita incomes, GDP, maternal health, infant mortality, all of that. I don't wish to give you details relating to the progress that has been accomplished in each of these fields during the 3 years which have elapsed since the termination of the conflict. I only want to share with you some thoughts about what has made this possible, this transition from conflict to stability and prosperity. What have been the cornerstones of the policy which has guided the government of His Excellency President Mahinda Rajapaksa? Within the brief space of 15 minutes, I will share with you some of the conceptual underpinnings of the policies that we have pursued. First and foremost, we believe that economic development is important. Unless the economy grows, there's nothing that you can do. Now, we are legitimately proud of the fact that the Sri Lankan economy is today growing at the rate of more than 8%, which I think is undoubtedly an achievement given the challenging global and regional environment in which we have to operate. So 8% growth. That is the first essential requirement. It is an essential requirement, but by no means a sufficient requirement. We believe that if the country is to enjoy to the fullest possible extent the fruits of economic development, there is a definite role for the state. And we make no apology for expressing that point of view. Certainly in a country like ours, and the whole of South Asia, we cannot rely on economic development per se to confer upon all the people of the country the benefits to which they are entitled as participants and beneficiaries. No doubt in the fullness of time that would happen, but human patience is finite. Therefore, there is a need for measured, discriminating intervention by the state to ensure equitable distribution of the advantages of economic development up and down the country. This is necessary to ensure that economic development and the benefits that accompany it are not restricted to the urban environment, the principal cities of the country, but penetrate the rural hinterland and make a tangible difference to the lives of people. So the quality of life has to improve, and this will happen only if there is discriminating intervention by the state to ensure that the most vulnerable segments of the community are not excluded from enjoyment of the fruits of economic development. So I would identify that as the second essential condition. The third is that the government of Sri Lanka has placed a very sharp emphasis on the development of infrastructure. Even if we find our resources inadequate to attend to everything else that is crying out for attention, the development of infrastructure is a prime requisite. This enhances connectivity. It enables investment to take place in the remoter regions of the country. Farmers are enabled to take their produce to the marketplace. And it has been the empirical experience of Sri Lanka that whatever fiscal benefits you offer potential investors, like exemption from a wide array of taxes, you will not achieve the goals that you have in mind unless you pay due attention to the development of highways, railway systems, ports and harbors. All of this is absolutely necessary to energize the economy and to bring about the kind of economic renaissance which we are seeing in all parts of Sri Lanka since the cessation of the conflict 3 years ago. So the development of infrastructure is absolutely essential. It is also necessary to ensure that we have vibrant representative institutions. The Nobel laureate Amartya Sen, speaking of famine, said that the main cause of famine is not the lack of food, but the lack of public opinion. He was able to demonstrate very convincingly in some of his celebrated works that famine has never occurred in a country where there was vibrant public opinion, where there was a press, television, and the ability of people of all strata of society to articulate their views without inhibition. He identified that as a very powerful disincentive against the incidence of famine. Now, in Sri Lanka, we have paid particular attention to the vigor and the vitality of representative institutions, especially at the grassroots level. We call them Pradeshia Sabhas. They're roughly the equivalent of the panchayats, which receive entrenchment and explicit protection in terms of the Constitution of India. But these institutions play a vital role in reviving the economy and enhancing the quality of life, because the idea, as far as possible, is to ensure that as far as government projects are concerned, the beneficiaries are the managers. You know, this has also been the experience of India. I don't know whether many of you have heard of the landmark legislation, which in India has been described as the Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which makes it possible for the poorest families in the subcontinent to have access to minimum thresholds of income, because employment for a certain number of days in the year is guaranteed by the state. Now, as far as public projects are concerned in Sri Lanka, we see to it that money is put in the hands of the people who are expected to benefit from the implementation of the project. For example, if the idea is to build a primary school, the money will be made available not to a board of trustees who really have no direct interest in the success of the project, but as far as possible, the parents of the children who are going to be educated in that school will be the direct beneficiaries of the resources made available by the state. So they have a direct interest in ensuring that there is no waste, no incompetence. And this is the way of maximizing the benefits that flow to the vast mass of the people as a result of expenditure incurred by the state in projects of that nature. So a vigorous system of representative institutions, not only at the level of parliament, not at the apex of the structure, but lower down. This has been one of the reasons why we have been able to achieve such singular success with regard to moving our economy forward within so remarkably short a period after the end of the war. We have also found it necessary to inculcate in the country a culture that is based on a rights-oriented approach. That is, people in the country must feel that there is entitlement on their part to certain benefits. These are made available not as a result of leave and license, not as a result of benevolence on the part of the state, but it is an entitlement that is guaranteed by the legal system that is established in the country. And in that sense, we have made discriminating use of a concept that is well known in the United States of America, that is affirmative action or reverse discrimination. For example, when we select students for admission to the universities of our country, we take into account not the raw mark that is scored by a student, but rather the paucity or the adequacy of secondary school facilities available in that part of the country from which the student comes. This is the principle that was upheld by the Supreme Court of the United States in the famous Bakke case, where reference was made to a principle that goes back a long time, many centuries. It is to be found in the Wisdom of Antiquity. Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics, says that there is as much injustice in treating unequals equally as there is in treating equals unequally. So, if two situations, if two people are intrinsically and inherently unequal, there is injustice involved in applying to both of them a uniform yardstick. It is only right that you take into account contextual factors. And this is what the government of Sri Lanka has done in constructing a pragmatic policy governing admission of students into the universities of the Republic. Indeed, in any area, whether you are talking of housing or welfare benefits or access to schools, if the demand far exceeds the supply, then you need to evolve an equitable system to determine who among the many that are clamoring for these benefits should really be chosen as the selected beneficiaries. So a rights-based approach has empowered people in our country. It has enhanced a sense of dignity on their part. They're not throwing themselves on the state to receive from the state whatever the state is inclined to dish out. But what they get is what they are entitled to in terms of the legal system that prevails in the country. I think that also is an important facet of public policy which has made possible the achievements that I have briefly described to you. Then finally, with regard to the international community and the manner in which the international community can contribute constructively to the well-being of our nation, we certainly believe that no nation in the complex world in which we live today can work in isolation. We have to build bridges with the international community, but subject to the caveat that we have to understand the diversity and the complexity of cultures in different parts of the world. Painful events which have taken place in different parts of the world very recently, during the last 2 or 3 weeks, in fact, remind us of that reality. There's no size that suits everybody. There are different paths to the summit of a mountain. Societies are different in terms of their historical origins, their societal structures, their cultural mores. And therefore, we have to recognize that a solution that has worked exceedingly well in one culture cannot be physically transplanted and applied without modification in other cultures. So there has to be respect for the identity of countries, for the cultures and civilizations to which they are heirs. And I would suggest that that is very much the spirit in which we can work together towards the accomplishment of the objectives that we all hold to be important and indeed sacrosanct. So these are some of the thoughts that I would like to leave with you so that you can ponder over the empirical experience of my own country, which I think has more than a purely national interest. Its comparative dimension, some of the policies that we have tried to apply in our country, some of the approaches that we have adopted in dealing with very complex situations may be of interest to other countries in deciding how they could best grapple with very complex problems within reasonably short periods of time. And I hope that these observations of mine on the recent experience of Sri Lanka will serve a useful purpose from that point of view. I thank the Foreign Policy Association once more for bestowing on me the honor of inviting me to be present here with you on this occasion and to share these thoughts with you. I thank you.